This is my first Crowdpac event, and I hope that this is coming through. I've become somewhat of a Zoom aficionado, but I'm still dealing with all our other modes of distribution. For all of you who are visiting tonight, thank you for participating in this Crowdpac town hall. I'm looking forward to your questions and comments and suggestions. I am back in my kitchen. Those of you who have followed my recent endeavors may know that a couple weeks back I took a little time out and created what I thought was going to be kind of a quick little joke video about creating a tuna melt, and it did all take place in this little kitchen behind me. It was a little humbling in the fact that it got more attention than almost any of my recent policy positions, or for that matter, any other senator's recent policy positions. But this is where the magic happened. I hope everybody is well. First and foremost, I appreciate you taking 45 minutes or so tonight to join with me as I try to answer questions about the issues that we face as a country, as we face in Virginia, as we face in the world. None of us, I think, would have anticipated a few days before Memorial Day weekend that we would still be in this kind of enormous economic turmoil, even candidly this kind of weather. And I hope all of you are safe, and you and your families are safe and secure. I know one of the comments there that my face looks huge, but that's the face. So so be it. I know Nancy from Pocosin just asked a question. I'll come to that in a minute. Let me give a couple opening comments first. I mean, we're obviously in this enormously difficult period. More than 30 million of our fellow Americans have lost their jobs. Literally 40% of everybody who makes $40,000 or less has lost their job in the last couple of months. We've had another 25 million plus people lose their health care. We basically, with this much unemployment, combined with folks who didn't have health care before, have enormous crisis there. We've spent, as the federal government, about $2.7 trillion directly, and another $4 trillion are about to be lent out by the Federal Reserve Bank. And we've seen, unfortunately, this administration, and people are mostly wondering, where's my check? And some of that money's gone direct. Some of that has gone in the expanded unemployment, which has been very helpful to folks. A lot of it, $600 billion of it, has gone in the PPP program, which I hope we'll come back to and be able to answer some questions on. Some good there, some bad in terms of design flaws, not requiring companies that were showing an actual economic distress, or public companies, some of the wrong folks getting those funds. Some of that's trying to be corrected at this point, but enormous efforts by the federal government. And then we've got the challenges around the virus. I think it is remarkable that this administration has not taken on the responsibility of trying to manage PPE, the gloves, the masks, the gowns that we need to stay safe. We've instead created this kind of dog-eat-dog competition between hospital system states that has driven up the cost and I think, frankly, limited the supply. And then after the failure of the administration on PPE, we've seen that failure almost duplicated or made worse by the failure to take control of testing. And I want to reopen our economy, but without the ability to have adequate testing, we're not going to be able to do this. And we desperately need some master database in terms of the amount of tests we have, the capabilities, what's in the pipeline. And I again think, as we look back, one of the great failures will be the failure to deal with PPE and testing. And one of the things I'm working on right now is also trying to make sure that we don't make the same mistakes when it comes to vaccinations. We need to make sure that we are doing experimentation, as we think about how we get to a vaccination, that we test all communities, that we make sure we have a domestic supply chain, that we make sure as well that we are going to be able to distribute a vaccination when we have it in a fair and equitable way. Last comment before we get to the questions, I want to talk about something that I've been working on, and it's been kind of an interesting alliance. Bernie Sanders is my partner on it, I've got Doug Jones, also a partner. There's actually a Republican variation. It's called the Paycheck Security Act, and it'll be introduced later this week. And my hope is it will give a suggestion on, before we simply re-up some of these existing programs that we put in place, as well-intentioned as we are, that we take a pause and realize, before we allow our economy to go to 25% unemployment, which we appear to be headed to go, we should say, is there a better way to get this aid to workers who've been dislocated? The European model, which has used this direct paycheck support, where the government doesn't go through a bank, doesn't go through some other program, but would actually pay 70, 80, 100% of your salary up to some fixed amount. I would argue 100% up to $90,000 for anyone that's been laid off. It would minimize the amount of bureaucracy. It would reconnect workers with their firms and get them back into a level of healthcare coverage. And as we've seen in countries like Germany and Denmark and elsewhere, it has minimized the amount of unemployment. And there are proposals to the right of me with Josh Hawley and Cory Gardner from the Republicans in the Senate. There's actually been support on this from both the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, and they don't agree on anything, as most of us know. And so I would urge all of you later in the week, when we introduce this, and it's already received some press attention, it's called the Paycheck Security Act, but might be a way as we move forward on the next step of how we deal with COVID-19. It would be my idea on how we might, again, directly help those workers who've been displaced. We would also have prerequisites that you have to show an economic loss so that some of these public, large public companies would not benefit. But I think it would be a fairer approach, and I'd welcome comments and suggestions from those of you, if not tonight, in the coming days. With that, why don't we go ahead and start taking some of these questions. Nancy from Pocosin is asking, what can we do to keep the Postal Service afloat during this crisis? Let me say, Nancy, that the challenge with our Postal Service is two or threefold. I, one, firmly support additional federal assistance to our Postal Service. It's in the Constitution. We ought to support our post offices. It is the only way we can get that last mile delivered. If you live at the end of some long road or you live in some rural area, candidly, the private sector, UPS and FedEx, aren't going to deliver it. Matter of fact, they currently utilize the post office. And in many ways, what people don't realize is that the post office on an annual basis, until the last year or so, has actually been making a profit. The reason it's not shown that on an operating basis, the reason it's not shown that is back in 2006, there was a congressional arrangement before I was in Congress that basically saddled the post office with I can't remember the amount, like $5 or $6 billion additional pension obligations. I think that obligation ought to be renegotiated in a way that protects former postal workers. But let's look at the Postal Service as an operating business, and are there ways that some of our post offices can share services with stores in rural areas? I'm open to that. But the idea of the Trump administration of let's just cut out our postal workers, let's just let it fall apart at this critical moment is not something I support. So let's renegotiate the pension issues. Let's deal with direct support. Let's also look at reforms. But I think the Postal Service needs to be maintained and needs to be done in a fair and equitable way. And those postal workers, sometimes I get in trouble when I start naming off frontline workers, because so much of America are frontline workers, but so many of our postal workers are frontline workers as well and deserve that kind of support. Thank you, Nancy, for the question. Roz from Falls Church says, says the coronavirus seems to be very dangerous for those folks over 60 that may be immune compromised. Will future clinical trials take into consideration that group? And I say that as somebody who is in that, I'm in that target group, Roz. I'm 65. I've got some, respiratory issues. So this is more than passing interest to me. And I think when we think both about testing and we think about trials for vaccination, it is extraordinarily important that we do this in a fair and equitable way. One of the things this virus has shown up, and something that I think most of us realize, but it's shown it in a very visceral way, is the enormous racial and economic disparities we have in our country. I've been very concerned, let me just step back, that any of the federal initiatives to deal with COVID ought to include some level of disparity study so that we really are looking at who has been disproportionately affected by COVID-19. I think it would often show our black and brown communities, but I think it may show rural as well. But let's make sure that we're building a data case on where we need to give the additional support as we rebuild, number one. Number two, on testing, I'm enormously concerned that we make sure that testing is made available to those communities, whether they are older, whether they are people of color that have disproportionately been affected. And Roz, to your point, we really need to make sure that as they start these vaccination trials, that we include the communities that get tested look like the communities that have been affected. And that means particularly older people, and again, that means communities of color. And one of the things I'm trying to do is make sure that as we put forward additional money on testing and vaccinations, we put that as a prerequisite, because candidly, I'm not sure I trust our medical schools and others who are doing some of this. I'm not sure I fully trust the administration on this issue. So I think we have to mandate that into law. Thanks for your question. David says, oh gosh, David is asking, what are we doing to protect the integrity of our elections this fall? And I did another event on Zoom a little bit right before this. This was a question I get on at every turn. Let me say there are three things I think we need to focus on. One, I strongly support moving more and more of our election system this year to vote by mail. I think we've seen that in many states, that it can be done safely, efficiently. It actually turns up turnout. Unfortunately, I think this president and the majority leader are going to preclude a federal vote by mail legislation that I support, that Ron Wyden and Amy Klobuchar are the leads on. I do think each bill that we put out, though, we add additional funding for election security. We put $400 million in the last bill. In Virginia, what we've been able to do, for example, with the Democratic legislature, is allow unlimited absentee voting. We've allowed a lot of additional pre-election day voting, up to 20 days pre-election day. So having those funds, which will help pay the poll workers, so that we can, again, if the virus is back out in the fall, how do we make sure that, one, you can vote by mail, but two, if you don't want to vote by mail, that you could go after church, that you could go, during the 2 weeks beforehand to a facility that's not going to be crowded. And one of the things I'm working on is both getting federal funds to support that from an institutional standpoint, and then my campaign, and I hope the Biden campaign and others will help educate voters about these alternative methods. Because in a state like ours, we've not had as much absentee as in the past. That'll dramatically change. That's number one on election security. Number two is we have to continue to monitor our social media platforms, the Facebooks, the YouTubes, the Twitters. They have gotten better, and I have put enormous pressure on them over the last 3.5 years. They are not perfect by any means, but both through the power of whatever voice I have as vice chair of the Intelligence Committee and public pressure, we need to make sure that these social media companies continue to monitor the Russian bots, trolls, other foreign influences. I frankly think it's inexcusable that Congress hasn't put in place some rules of the road for those social media companies. I don't think we're going to get that done before November because of, again, the pushback from the administration. But I'm going to stay on, as I see reports of manipulation, stay on the social media companies. The third thing we can do, and this is really important, is inside the intelligence community, and I have great respect for many of the professionals in the intelligence community. We've got a group of people at the Director of National Intelligence, a group of people at NSA who are working on election security, and their voices need to be heard. If they find things, they need to be able to report. One of the reasons why I've been so concerned about the president's firing of the inspector generals, not just in the intelligence community, but we've seen recently at the State Department, HHS, is that if the workforce feels they can't report something, and you have an administration that doesn't want to have truth spoken to it, and that truth may be that the Russians are once again intervening, they have to feel a comfortable place to go. And that's why the role of these inspector generals is so absolutely critical. So one is what the states themselves are doing to open up the process and how we can push. And we've made progress in Virginia. But in future federal legislation, we'll at least be able to get more money out. Two, continuing to monitor the social media companies about their need to self-police. Not good enough, but is a step. And then three, my job, particularly as Vice Chair of the Intel Committee, to make sure that those intelligence professionals can still speak truth to power. And if the White House doesn't want to hear, at least our committee will hear and try to get that message out. But thank you for that question. It's really important. Brian from Great Falls has said, what can we do to support or increase the federal response on testing during coronavirus? And Brian, the president asked me to be on his reopen task force, and I don't agree with the president on a lot of things, but I said I'd be, I'm willing to serve on that task force. But to give people the confidence they need to reopen, we need more testing. So I have begged the vice president, create a master database that says state by state, county by county, how much testing capability do we have, what's in the pipeline coming down about to be approved from the FDA, what are the protocols. We need more data. And unfortunately, the vice president has turned that down, and there is not that public site. It ought to be transparent. So instead, what I've worked on, Brian, is working with Johns Hopkins University, who I think is a pretty trusted name, not a Virginia university, but a pretty trusted name. They are the website that's created the definitive data site for the growth of the virus. Most press reports cite Johns Hopkins, not the CDC, which is kind of a commentary in itself. But they went live, I think, middle of last week with their testing site. I'm trying to encourage states and others to dump their data with Johns Hopkins. We desperately need this database that people can trust about what the testing capability is. This is not a question of money. We put $25 billion into the last COVID package to support this. This is a question of getting the information out in a clear and transparent way. And I promise, anything we do next, both on testing and vaccinations, I'm going to just push this data. I think people are, maybe not everybody at the White House, but everybody else is willing to rely on scientific and medical expertise. But if you don't have that data about where the testing capability is and what the results are, we're going to be less prepared going forward. But thank you for the question. Olivia says, Olivia is asking a question about, she's saying, how can we make sure that everybody has access to food during this time? And Olivia, that is a great question. And I'm grateful for all of you who support me or support other political candidates. But I hope during these times, if you've got a little extra resources, you'll think about giving to your food banks. Lisa and I gave to each of the regional food banks in Virginia, and they are doing a remarkable job. I've also just recently joined legislation with Kamala Harris and John Boozman and Tim Scott, bipartisan legislation that would take great examples of folks like Jose Andres, who has created something through his central kitchen where he's going around reopening restaurants in communities to provide food to first responders, gets that restaurant back, operating a little bit. And I say he ought to get 100% FEMA reimbursement for those kind of activities. So there's things we can do individually with our food banks. There's things we can do federally with legislation like this FEMA reimbursement. But there's also structural things. And former Secretary Tom Vilsack, Secretary of Agriculture, Tom Vilsack, I've been working with him, is how do we really move our food supply? We generally have two food supplies in this country, one that went to grocery stores and one that went to restaurants. During the period of the COVID, we need to kind of, the grocery store stuff is moving fine, but everybody's buying stuff out of the grocery store, so they're not able to donate as much to the food banks. The restaurant food supply chain, it's been really a challenge to redirect that either to direct sale to consumers or to food banks. We've made some progress. Former Secretary Vilsack has been helping me on that, but where we start as individuals, I think, is if you've got a little extra resources and your family's not been really hard hit, and I know many of us have been, but if you're not I'm a strong believer in our food banks. Thanks for your question. Daphne from Bumpass says, concerned about the lack of broadband, and is there any chance that this issue can be resolved in her lifetime? Daphne, I 100% agree with you. You may know my background was in wireless communications. I was the co-founder of Nextel. Back when I was governor, I was very proud of the fact that we made the largest investment, I think, at that point in the country in rural broadband deployment. It was through a company, not a company, but a co-op called the Mid-Atlantic Broadband Consortium. And I think one of the things that's come out of this virus is that broadband is not a nice to have, it's essential. If we're going to be able to transform medicine in terms of telehealth, you got to have broadband. If we're going to be able to continue to not have a greater disparity, both in terms of access to broadband and affordability on broadband, on studies, you've got to have that. And frankly, I think there's going to be a number of people that are going to rethink where they want to live. And I've been a huge advocate of rural redevelopment, but you got to have broadband. Doesn't guarantee you success, but you got to have it. There are three things that I think we can do on broadband. The big plan, and the House bill had some of this in there, $80 to $100 billion to go ahead and finish building out broadband, the same way our country made the commitment to building out rural electrification in the 1930s. Now, as somebody that knows something about this field, that last mile, whether it's wired or wireless or satellite, we could still debate, but let's go ahead and put in the infrastructure. That's the big plan. The medium plan says, let's go ahead and allow, if an ISP, an internet service provider, is not providing broadband, and there might be a local utility or a local community that says we want to stand up a competitor, I think we need to do that. I think these ISPs cannot control an area and not build it out just because it's not economic feasible. And if some other kind of public-related entity can, we ought to give them that choice. And then the immediate answer, and I've been very disappointed this has not come out in any of the bills, and I'm going to try to put it in the next Senate bill. And this would not cover everyone, but it would cover about 25 or 30% of the uncovered parts in Virginia and around our country. If we, and I've talked to the chairman of the FCC about this, if we simply turned up the power on some of our antennas, if we simply put temporary towers on some of our school buildings in rural areas that may be linked, but none of the community around receives because there's not an ISP antenna around. But if you put that antenna on the school buildings that are called wireless internet service providers, WISPs, on a temporary basis. If we said around federal facilities, we ought to take the 75-kilometer exclusion and move it to 35-kilometer exclusion, we could literally cover another third of uncovered America in a month or so with virtually very, very little cost expenditure. And we just need to have the will to do it. And if we could use some of the existing E-rate monies that we all pay into this fund and let it help those help provide this at least emergency service for the balance of this year, I think we could get this solved. And it's just going to take, and it won't be a perfect solution, but it could be a short-term, middle-term, and then the larger build-out plan that the House has proposed. But thanks for the question, because it is a passion and a necessity. Choctaw Ridge is saying, Bob from Burke is asking, John Warner. Bob was asking whether John Warner, the person who I ran against in 1996, Republican senator, who I have huge respect for, is supporting my campaign in 2020. He first endorsed me in 2014. I'm extraordinarily proud of that endorsement. He and I don't agree on everything. He's a Republican, I'm a Democrat, but boy, oh boy, a classy, great Virginian, great American, 92 years young, maybe 93 at this point. I just saw him a month or so ago, but I'm proud to have his support. And thanks for that question or comment. Bruce from Rockingham, how realistic is that Congress can pass a law that expands options for voting, like expanding early voting without an excuse and expanding absentee voting? Bruce, I strongly support that expanded voting opportunity. I strongly support, a vote by mail. I candidly don't think, as long as Donald Trump is president and Mitch McConnell is majority leader, that we're going to have that kind of federal expansion of voting. I do think what we can do in each of these relief packages, we can put in additional money to the secretaries of state for expanding voting. Because some of this is both constraints you see from a political basis, but it may be that a secretary of state or a local registrar doesn't have the funds to offer more early voting. We put $400 million in the last COVID bill. I know we're committed that whatever we do next on COVID, there will be additional money for expanding voting. And I don't want to be a naive optimist, and I know folks on this call will check out my data here, but my understanding is Georgia, which has been very restrictive on expanding voting, they have a major Republican primary in June, and my understanding is the Republican Secretary of State sent out 7 million absentee ballots, unprecedented. And if it can happen in Georgia, maybe it can happen everywhere. But I'm not sure we're going to get federal legislation, but we're going to keep chipping away, at least with financial support. Thanks for the question. John from Virginia Beach is asking, what are you doing to help 1099 workers during the pandemic? And John, thank you for that question. This is something I've been working on for literally the last 5 years, which is recognizing that not every American is going to work a traditional 40-hour-a-week, what's called W-2 job. 1099 is the IRS designation for those workers who are independent contractors. And the way we think a lot about that is gig workers, somebody who might drive Uber or make stuff on Etsy or deliver for Postmates or Uber Eats. And one of the things that was, I think, a very good thing that came out of the previous COVID bill was an expansion of unemployment to cover everyone who is a worker. I think this notion of just W-2 workers, that's a 20th century notion. Matter of fact, traditional Virginia unemployment only covered about 30% of our workforce. So this expansion to cover all workers, 1099 workers, is, I think, a great thing. We need to make that permanent. And one of the things that I've got legislation on that is bipartisan, but more Democratic support, which says, I think we need to move to a portable benefit system. I think no matter what kind of work you do in America, whether we call it gig worker, independent contractor, 1099, from the first hour you work, some portion of that dollar you make ought to be set aside for benefits. Those benefits ought to attach to you personally, and they ought to be portable and able to accrue as you move from job to job throughout your career. Very few people are going to work for the same company the way my dad did for 38 years when I was a kid, and we think we need to meet the workforce where it's at, and we need to give them the social insurance and the social contract that I think the COVID virus is exposing that too many American workers don't have at this point. But thanks for your question, John. All right, I'm waiting for the next where I can keep rambling on another subject. All right, let's go to, there we go. Dennis is asking, thanks for this town hall. What should be done to require the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence? And I'm not sure what the rest of the question was, but one of the most important things that our intelligence community needs to do is be willing to speak truth to power. I didn't know a lot about the intelligence community 10 or 11 years ago. I've been amazingly impressed by the integrity of most all of the folks who protect our country in the intelligence community. There's literally more than a dozen different agencies that are in that area, and most of these people, obviously by the nature of their jobs, work in some level of secrecy or obscurity. They don't get the same recognition that our military does, but they keep us safe. And their job at the end of the day is to ferret out intelligence, analyze it, and tell the truth to policymakers, whether the policymakers want to hear it or not. It's one of the reasons why I'm so concerned about the president's firing of the inspector generals. Oftentimes the inspector generals have to protect whistleblowers, and let's face it, it was a whistleblower who exposed the president's totally inappropriate call with the Ukrainian president. That kind of workforce needs to be able to tell the truth, and it is something that I am focused on every day, trying to protect those inspector generals, trying to make sure that the intelligence community feels they've got the backing of of our committee. One of the things I'm proud of is that our committee has stayed bipartisan, the Senate Intelligence Committee. Matter of fact, one of the things that just happened, didn't get a lot of attention, but just happened at the end of last week, is we finished our 5th volume of our investigation into the Russian interference in 2016. Now, you're going to hear a lot from the Trump campaign trying to rewrite history that said that Russia didn't interfere or somehow that Mr. Trump was the victim. I will allow the American public, anyone that wants to read our reports, all bipartisan, that have confirmed that Russia interfered. They did it to help Mr. Trump, and this last volume is almost 1,000 pages, and it is essential that the American public reads that, and as much as possible. And it has been now submitted for the ability to kind of get the secret stuff redacted, but we're going to push to get that out. But it all goes back to making sure you've got an intelligence community that can speak truth to power, and that is something that I am absolutely focused on a daily basis. Thanks. Heather from Fairfax. This is a great question. What are your ideas to keep women and children safe from gun violence during the pandemic? Well, Heather, I've strongly supported what we finally did in Virginia. But people say voting doesn't make a difference. I would point to the fact that our General Assembly has passed now, I think, some sensible gun laws, and I think that will make us safer. My fear, not only though in terms of the pandemic, and we have seen the incidence of crime go down, at least as I talk to my local police here, and some of the reports, I think the overall crime rate is down. But for women and children during this period, I am gravely concerned, and I'm not seeing gun violence necessarily go up against women and children, but I am concerned about child abuse. I'm concerned about spousal abuse. I'm concerned about families that are sequestered together, that can't get out, that with economic pressures rising, that can translate into abuse. And I think we need, one of the things that actually one of my colleagues, Debbie Stabenow, has been a real leader on is how we make sure that in the whatever additional federal response we do, that we put more resources into mental health, that we put more resources into ways for folks to contact and get help if they're victims of abuse. I think we have to be realistic enough to acknowledge that the economic and PTSD results of this virus are going to be with us for some time to come, and that can sometimes take the form of abuse towards women and children. And we all have to do all we can. I think the federal government can increase resources. I think we all need, as citizens, to candidly, to just reach out to friends and family, people that we may not see often. Just reestablish some contact and tell people you care about them. Show them a little more grace during this period, because I think the stress that so many folks are under at this point is frankly unprecedented. And my great fear is that may then play itself out in, at the worst in terms of gun violence, but it could also play itself out in a series of other violence in families. And we just have to do all we can to guard against that.
Just a
important question. All right. My phone going off. We got multiple devices here, and trying to make sure we get to these questions. Well, I know we've got. Let me get one more comment here that I wanted to make, and that was, we're going again through unprecedented times, and my hope would be, I know we're going to get through this. It kind of goes a little bit back to my last comment. There are clearly things that we in government can do, and I commit to you that I'm going to stay on the front lines fighting, whether it's for paycheck security, whether it's for making sure our elections are safe, whether it's making sure that we put the mental health and other kind of support that families are going to need as they come out of this crisis. But there is something that we all can do as well. And some of it starts as simple as recognizing that a whole lot of folks are are in duress at this point. And the more we can all do individually to reach out to friends, neighbors, maybe that person you've not heard from a long time, if they are, sheltering alone, that willingness to reach out and tell somebody you care about them, boy, oh boy, that could go a long, long way towards helping people, get through these times. I know that we're starting to see states all reopen. I want to see us reopen our economy, but we've got to do that in a way that people feel safe. It's one of the reasons I go back to where I started. We need dramatically increased testing capacity. We need, as one of the earlier questions, to make sure is that we move into the vaccination trials, that we are testing all the appropriate groups of Americans and those groups that have disproportionately been affected to get through this, because it is going to take us a while to come back. I promise I'll do my part from the governmental standpoint. I know you as Virginians and Americans will do your part as well, and we got to keep the faith, and at the end of the day, hopefully be willing to show a little more grace to each other, even folks we disagree. I'm not sure that's a message that's going to get through to the White House, but we can show our character as Virginians and Americans. And at the end of the day, I count on that to be successful. So again, I hope everyone has that everybody stays safe, stays secure, that as much as possible with the challenges that we get through Memorial Day, that we can, not only, reflect and maybe think about the start of summer, but also think about all those brave Americans who helped make this country the greatest in the world. So thank you so much for being with me tonight. Stay safe, and I will see you soon.